Thank you everyone for joining us today. I have Phil Nesci here, and Philip is an IBRS advisor who specialises in IT management, and in this interview we're going to be really drilling down onto the topic of cyber resilience. Now Phil, thank you for joining us. What I don't quite understand is what's the difference between the cyber security stuff that we've been talking about for almost half a decade now or more, and this new notion of cyber resilience. Aren't they just the same thing?
Thanks, Joe. Organisations have been talking about cybersecurity, as you say, for a long time, and they've come at it primarily from a technological perspective. Organisations are now starting to recognise that they are going to be a target sooner or later, and they're now focusing on making sure that the organisation can actually effectively respond to a cyber incident. So that's the difference between cyber resilience and cyber security. It's recognising the fact that cyber response is in many ways an organisational-wide response rather than a technology response.
So when you say you're going to get attacked, I mean, most organisations are being attacked all the time. So when you say they're going to get attacked, you really mean successfully attacked. Is that what you're referring to?
Correct.
So the key difference here is a focus not just on trying to prevent, but a realisation that sooner or later you're going to have an incident. You need to be ready with various continuity plans to make sure that, one, you don't get brought down, and two, that you can respond and remediate any of the problems that have arisen from this.
Yeah, exactly. And most organisations are taking kind of a multidimensional approach to cyber resilience. First of all, identifying the various threats, making sure that the organisation is effectively in a good position to prevent some of those threats, but importantly, what is the organisation response and how do you recover from a cyber incident? And related to that, how do you actually protect your very valuable data? So those are the key areas of focus for most organisations.
So let's then take a look at one of the difficulties with this, which is you actually don't know. It's very difficult to know exactly how and when and where you're going to get attacked, how that vector is going to come through, and how the hackers are going to use that data, because that is evolving very quickly. How do you build in resilience for something that is inherently an unknown?
You have to approach that along very different dimensions. First of all, you need a holistic cyber incident response plan, and the cyber incident response plan should be part of the overall organisation crisis management plan. So an effective cyber resilience plan that envisages the various types of scenarios. For example, we know that ransomware is a very common vector. Phishing is a very common factor. Denial of service is also a very common vector. So it's really envisaging and having playbook scenarios for each of those and making sure that your cyber response teams are well drilled in those scenarios and know how to respond. Ultimately, of course, the reality will be quite different from any plan, but at least having the plans in place will give most organisations a framework in which you can respond. It's a little bit like having a set piece in a soccer match. When somebody takes a corner, you always know who's going to be taking that corner and what the other players are going to do. The reality of the match will always be different, but at least you have a set piece and a basic game plan on how to manage a particular incident.
So Phil, one of the things that you've spoken to me about is the increased attention that boards are placing on this notion of cyber resilience. What do we do after something has happened? Now, some of that is being driven obviously by the increased risk profile with everyone working from home. Some of it's being driven by the increased risk profile of just the hackers being much more active and being much more targeted and being more sophisticated. But in your thoughts, what would be the sort of things that the boards are now coming to the CTO, the CISO, the CIO and saying, you need to have these things covered? What are the things that you need to be prepared for as a senior IT executive?
One of the key roles of boards is the oversight of risk, and clearly cyber is an enterprise-wide risk. So the sorts of questions boards are asking are some of the following. For example, which executive is responsible for cyber resilience? and how well is the critical data of the organisation being protected? Are we storing our critical data offshore, which has got quite a number of implications? Do we have business continuity plans? And do our business continuity plans include the cyber resilience plans that we spoke about with the different scenarios? And do we undertake regular testing of those cyber resilience plans?
Well, there's a lot in that, and certainly those are a lot of questions which these senior IT executives have to grapple with. But the first one really struck with me, which is who's responsible. Ultimately, when things go wrong, somebody has to be the nexus. They've got to be the driver. Is that going to be the CISO, or is it going to be CTO, or does it really need to be elevated to a another role within the organisation? How does that look?
It varies. It varies according to the organisation type. If you're a large organisation, most likely you will have a dedicated CISO, or you can have another executive who's actually responsible for the cyber resilience. But ultimately, it's got to be integrated into the enterprise cyber plan. So having a dedicated executive or senior person who's responsible for a smaller organisation, it may or may not be a full-time position, but it needs to be a designated accountability of somebody in the organisation that is responsible for driving the cyber resilience forward.
It must be a very brave person or someone with an incredibly thick skin.
Indeed.
Typically, does that job usually fall upon the current CISOs for organisations that have them? Or is it more often now falling upon people who are responsible for the overall business continuity planning?
It's actually both. CISO tend to focus on the cyber aspects, whereas the risk managers within an organisation tend to focus on the enterprise risk and how to manage that enterprise risk. So in a substantial cyber crisis, most organisations will engage the CISO and the enterprise risk management, and they work as one, because at the end of the day, you need an enterprise-wide response, which involves technology. It will involve legal, it may involve HR, it may involve public relations, pretty well an enterprise-wide crisis management approach, of which cyber is a specialist response within that.
And so one person would be the coordinator and would bring in all of those other resources as need be.
Exactly. But the role of the CISO goes well beyond that. Yeah, the role of the CISO has a number of dimensions to it. On one dimension, they are the technical specialists and advisors to the organisation about cyber security. They're also the if you like, highlighting the risk to the organisation of the various risk scenarios, of the attack vectors, of the threat landscape. On one hand, they need to be a technical specialist, but they also need to be a trusted business advisor that actually implement an effective cyber security policy and the cyber security incident response plan.
Well, let's actually take a look at what a cyber incident might look like, and how you would best prepare for that. So do you have any stories or anecdotes that you can share with us on what actually goes on?
I've been involved in a major cyber incident in my time as CIO at the Red Cross Blood Service. 3 months, unfortunately, it was 3 months into my tenure as CIO, otherwise I probably wouldn't have finished my tenure as a CIO. But being in a cyber incident is a bit like being in a washing machine for a period of at least a week, if not longer. Very stressful situation, particularly if you don't have well-prepared incident response plans. Very stressful for executive. A lot of different issues in a major incident need to be addressed, not least of which is the health and safety of executives and key support staff who in many circumstances have to work around 24/7. So figuring that out and managing the health is a key element. But it's absolutely, but it's certainly one of the most demanding and stressful incident management scenarios that I've experienced in my 35-year career.
So knowing what you know now, how would you go about preparing in future for a potential cyber incident? How would you get your game plan together?
First of all, you need to have the identify where your crown jewels, your data crown jewels are located, who's actually controlling them. That's number one. Secondly, you need to have an incident response plan, and that can be as basic as having identifying various groups of response teams and various escalation paths that can be triggered in a very short space of time. So really developing that process, those scenarios, and the crown jewels are three of the most fundamental things you could do in terms of preparing for a cyber incident. And I might add one other one there, Joe. The other one is to ensure you've got established relationships with specialist cyber response firms. Most organisations don't have the luxury of being able to have in-house all the specialist expertise they need around cyber. For example, in a number of scenarios, you may need forensics, you may need experts in dark web monitoring, you may need experts in all sorts of different disciplines. Having established relationships with those service providers and knowing how to engage those in a cyber response is also fairly critical in an effective cyber response plan.
It's really, really important advice, and I think it's something that a lot of us don't really think about. One of the most interesting evolutions that I've seen recently is this double whammy with ransomware, where they'll lock up your data and then they'll basically blackmail you, saying that they'll put it on the dark web. And we've seen that with a number of Australian organisations now. We seem to be getting an absolute plague of this. In those situations, I guess one of the questions is, one, you've got a cyber response plan and you're trying to deal with getting your data back, getting your business resilience, getting your business back up and running. But the other one is this idea of being blackmailed. What's your thoughts? Should you be paying up, which we're now seeing increasingly, which of course is takes you into an ethical dilemma? Should you be taking the risk that they don't actually have the data? How does that actually pan out from a cyber resilience and corporate protection perspective?
No one ever wants to be in a cyber ransomware scenario, and least of all, being in a position of having to pay a ransom. The best way of avoiding having to pay a ransom is to make sure you have your disaster recovery and backup plans in top shape, because the outcome of many ransomware scenarios is you may have to recover from bare metal. And if you can't do that in a substantial space of time, then the organisation is obviously going to be heavily impacted, operational impact, financial impact, and something you can't get insurance about is reputational and brand impact. Most insurance organisations will cover you, cyber insurance organisations will cover you for the costs of business interruption and recovery, but they will not cover you for brand damage, brand loss, and loss of future earnings.
And what about this issue of blackmail? So as I said, it's this 1-2 whammy of locking up your ability to do work, to trade. And the other one is releasing that highly sensitive information onto the internet. We saw that recently with a company called Blackboard. So in those situations, what would a continuity plan look like? What would a response look like?
It's a very complex business decision. If you find yourself in that sort of scenarios, you have to weigh up the ability and your confidence in being able to restore from backups and how long that might take you. If you're in the situation where you will not be able to recover from backups, you have to think seriously about evaluating some of your other options, which may lead you to consider eventually paying a ransom. Many organisations have paid ransom, and obviously the Data on those is fairly sparse for obvious reasons, but at the end of the day, it becomes a major business decision where you have to weigh up a number of competing factors. The ethics of paying a ransom, it's unpalatable, potentially the brand damage, potentially the fact that if you do pay a ransom, you may not be able to recover the keys and recover your systems versus paying a ransom. So very complex decision.
If you're sitting on a board of directors, what are the sort of questions that you should be asking the various stakeholders in the business, the CISO, the CTO, or whoever is responsible for this area? What questions should you be asking them to make sure that your risks, that the business risks that you are managing are fully covered off?
Okay. Well, it goes back to some of those points we made before, which is, first of all, where is our critical data? Who's controlling our critical data? And then boards, of course, being concerned about risk, have to ask the question about what is the risk profile of the organisation? Where are we exposed in terms of cyber? Which areas? And what is the level of risk and risk tolerance that we are prepared to accept? An important question for boards is also metrics. And, you know, what indicators are there that the organisation is managing the risk profile, and two, some of the operational metrics around cyber.